The night my son slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table, I heard the refrigerator hum louder than my own heartbeat. I watched his fingers tap the top page, a habit he'd picked up from Frank, impatient, rhythmic, almost affectionate, and I wondered when my son had learned to make requests without asking. Outside, the street lamp glazed the snowbanks in silver, and the kitchen window reflected my face back at me. Hair flattened from the bus ride, lipstick faded, eyes too alert for midnight. "It's nothing scary," he said, voice low, as if the house itself might overhear. Susan didn't speak. She only aligned the stack until every corner matched, then set a pen beside it like a utensil laid out for dinner. The pen was one I'd bought for Michael in college. Smooth black barrel, silver clip, returned to my life as a tool for agreeing. My palms stayed on my mug, warming them slowly, buying seconds. In that small pause, I saw the whole arrangement as if it were already finished. My boxes stacked in a room that wasn't mine, my laughter rationed, my gratitude expected on schedule. I breathed in the stale smell of bus exhaust, still clinging to my coat, and thought, not for the first time since Frank died, how easy it is for a home to become a ledger. Then Michael slid the papers closer, and the sound of them whispering over wood felt like a door closing very gently. He smiled and waited, and in his eyes I caught something rehearsed. Relief, maybe. Or the fragile pride of someone who believes paperwork can keep feelings tidy. I didn't reach for the pen. I simply listened to the hum and let it judge us at all. I had just unpacked my winter coat, still smelling like mothballs and bus exhaust. He smiled the way he used to when he wanted something from me, and that was when I knew my life had quietly changed. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that betrayal does not always shout. Sometimes it clears its throat politely and asks you to sign at the bottom. My name is Eleanor, though most people call me Ellie, or Grandma Ellie when they remember to look me in the eye. I buried my husband, Frank, 7 winters ago, on a gray morning when the ground was too frozen to accept him easily. We were married 44 years. He fixed radios, paid bills on time, and believed deeply in handshakes. When he died, the world became louder and emptier all at once. The house followed soon after. Property taxes rose, my pension stayed still, and the stairs began to feel steeper each month. I sold the place with careful hands and a steady voice, telling myself it was just a building, even as I folded memories into cardboard boxes. Michael called me himself, my only son. He said, "Mom, you don't have to struggle. Come live with us. You'll have your own room. You'll be close to the kids." His wife, Susan, echoed him in the background, her voice bright and busy. I cried after the call, not from sadness, but from relief. It felt like being chosen. Their house was neat in the way newer homes are, all clean lines and quiet corners. I noticed the camera above the garage when I arrived, the small black eye blinking patiently. Inside, Susan showed me the guest room that would be mine. Fresh sheets, a small dresser, a lamp that hummed faintly when turned on. I thanked her too many times. Old habits cling like dust. The first week passed gently. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, helped with homework. I paid for groceries once with my debit card, without thinking, the receipt still warm in my palm. Susan thanked me but didn't look up from her phone. Michael worked late. The children grew used to me being there, like a piece of furniture that tells stories if asked. Then came the envelope. Michael waited until the kids were asleep. Susan wiped the counter twice before sitting down. He placed the papers between us, squared and tidy. "Just something for clarity," he said. "It's standard." The word sounded borrowed, like a suit that didn't fit him. I adjusted my glasses and read slowly. Monthly rent, utilities divided by percentage. late fees, house rules typed in careful language. There was a clause about notice periods, another about shared spaces. My name misspelled once, corrected in pen. At the bottom, a place for my signature. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger yet, just confusion. I thought I was helping, I said. My voice surprised me with how small it sounded. Michael explained expenses. Susan nodded, her lips pressed thin. They spoke as if I were a line item, something to be managed. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I asked for a copy, and Michael slid one toward me, already prepared. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I listened to the house settle. Pipes clicked. The camera outside clicked too, once, like a blink. In the dark, I understood something I had missed before. I had been invited, yes, but not welcomed. And there is a difference that changes everything. I woke before sunrise, the way you do when your body still believes it has somewhere urgent to be. The hallway was dark and cold at the edges, and the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and yesterday's pasta sauce. On the kitchen counter, Susan had left the contract copy face up, as if paper could keep an eye on me while I slept. I made coffee quietly, measuring the grounds the way Frank used to, not because it mattered, but because ritual is what you cling to when the floor shifts under you. My hands shook just enough to splash a little water on the tile. I wiped it with a dish towel and told myself it was only water, only a towel, only a contract. At 7:30, Michael came in wearing his work lanyard, already half in another world. He kissed the top of my head the way you pat a dog you love but don't have time for. "Mom, don't take it personally," he murmured. "It's just grown-up stuff." Grown-up stuff. I almost laughed. I had been grown up since I was 19, and my own mother handed me a grocery list and a rent envelope in the same breath. After breakfast, Susan handed me a folder, a real one with plastic sleeves. Inside were printed utility bills, highlighted. Gas, electric, internet. She had circled the total and written a number beside it in neat blue ink. My portion. She spoke softly, like we were discussing the weather. "It's only fair," she said, and the word fair sat between us like a stone. I nodded, because nodding is sometimes what you do when you're trying not to crumble in front of your own child's wife. I asked if they'd like me to continue buying groceries, and Susan smiled as if I'd finally said something sensible. "That would really help," she replied. "You're so good at budgeting." That afternoon, I drove to the bank in my old Buick, the one Frank kept running with stubborn pride. The parking lot was crowded, and I had to circle twice before finding a spot near the cart return. Inside, the air smelled like carpet shampoo and quiet stress. I requested printed statements for the last 6 months, partly because I needed them, partly because holding them made me feel less invisible. The young teller slid the pages across with a practiced smile and asked if there was anything else. I almost told her everything, right there under the fluorescent lights, but I said, "No thank you," and tucked my life into my purse. Back in my room, I laid the contract on the bedspread and read it again with a pen in my hand, not to sign, but to understand. It called me tenant. It called Michael landlord. The word made my throat tighten. There were lines about inspections with reasonable notice. There were rules about guests, noise, storage. The part that stung most was the tone. So formal, so distant, as if love could be rewritten into a transaction. I started a small habit that day. I kept every receipt, groceries, gas, the children's school supplies, the printer paper Susan asked me to pick up. I stacked them in an envelope, and on the front I wrote the date in careful block letters. Not out of spite, out of clarity. If this house wanted grown-up rules, I could be grown-up. The first twist came in the sweetest disguise. Susan asked me to watch the kids on Friday night. "Just for a couple hours," she said, already slipping into her coat. Michael was taking her to dinner, something they hadn't done in forever. She made it sound romantic, almost like a compliment that she trusted me. I agreed, because I love those children, and because I still believed helpfulness might buy me tenderness. They returned after midnight. The next morning, I found a sticky note on my dresser. Babysitting counts as contribution, so thank you. Also, we'll need rent by the 1st. The heart at the end looked like it had been pressed into place to soften the blow. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at it until the letters blurred. Contribution. As if my time with my grandchildren was labor to be tallied, as if affection could be converted into credits. The second twist arrived as an accident. I went downstairs for a glass of water around 2 a.m. a few nights later. The house was silent, but the living room television glowed faintly, not fully off. On the screen was a paused frame from the security camera feed. Our driveway, the sidewalk, the street light making the pavement look wet, even when it wasn't. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. I understood that the cameras weren't just for strangers. They were for certainty, for control, for keeping a record of who came and went and when. In the days that followed, the rules of the house tightened like a belt. Susan began leaving reminders on the fridge. Laundry room closes at 9 p.m. Please wipe down sink after use. Do not adjust thermostat. One afternoon, she told me kindly that my perfume was a little strong and suggested I keep it in my room. That was when it hit me how small they were willing to make me, how neatly they were trimming my edges. Michael stayed gentle, but distant. When I tried to talk, he used the same calm tone he probably used with his employees. "Mom, we're just trying to be organized," he said. "It's not about you." But it was about me. It was about my body in their spare room, my presence in their kitchen, my breath in their hallway. I could feel myself turning into a problem they were solving. On the last day of the month, I wrote a check. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the contract had been slid toward me like a verdict. I filled in the amount exactly as written, in careful loops. I noted rent on the memo line, because if we were doing this, I would do it cleanly. I tore it from my checkbook with steady fingers and placed it in the envelope Susan had left by the fruit bowl. Susan picked it up without a word and tucked it into her planner. Not a thank you, not a look, just paper, moving from one hand to another. That evening, I opened my little envelope of receipts and statements and added the carbon copy of the check. Then I opened the Notes app on my phone and began typing dates, small facts, small truths. When the refrigerator hummed, I listened. When footsteps moved above my ceiling, I noticed. I wasn't plotting anything dramatic. I was simply waking up. Because there is a moment, late in life, when you realize your kindness has been mistaken for weakness. And once you see that clearly, you stop offering your soft parts to people who only know how to squeeze. The first time Susan corrected me in front of the children, something quiet inside me finally sat up straight. I had reminded my granddaughter to rinse her plate before placing it in the dishwasher, the way I always had. Susan smiled tightly and said, "We actually do it differently here," as if I were a guest who had overstayed a holiday. The kids looked from her to me, confused, and I felt myself fade in their eyes just a little. I told myself not to be dramatic. I had lived through worse things than a sharp tone and a chilly smile. I had buried a husband. I had signed papers that closed a life chapter forever. This was just discomfort, I thought. Temporary, but discomfort has a way of settling into your bones if you let it. Days began to feel monitored. Not openly, not cruelly, just enough to make me second-guess myself. If I lingered in the living room, Susan would mention screen time limits, even though I wasn't holding a remote. If I stepped outside to breathe in the evening air, Michael would glance at his phone, then up at the driveway camera, then back at me, all without saying a word. Silence can be louder than shouting. One afternoon, a small package arrived for me. Inside was a sweater I'd ordered online, paid for with my own card. Susan picked it up from the porch before I could. Later, she handed it to me and said, "Just so you know, packages should be noted. For safety." Safety. Another word that sounded kind until you held it up to the light. That night, I lay awake listening to the house. I thought about how many times I had opened my own door to family without conditions. How many times Frank and I had said, "Of course," without reaching for a calculator. We weren't rich, but we were generous in the ways that mattered. I wondered when that had become outdated. I began spending more time in my room, not sulking, just observing. From that quiet place, patterns emerged. Susan kept a household binder on a shelf near her desk. One day, while she was out, it slipped off when I brushed past. Papers scattered. I knelt slowly, my knees protesting, and gathered them. Maintenance schedules, warranty documents. And there, tucked neatly in a sleeve, a printed spreadsheet with my name on it. Monthly contributions, babysitting hours marked as 0, grocery payments noted as voluntary. My hands went cold. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I did not confront her. I did not cry. I felt something else take shape instead, something steadier and less exhausting. Clarity. The next morning, I called a local legal aid office I remembered from a flyer at the library. My voice was calm when I explained my situation. The woman on the line listened without interrupting. She asked if I had signed anything yet. I told her no. She asked if I had proof of payments. I said yes. She told me to keep everything and suggested I come in for a consultation. "You deserve to understand your position," she said. The word deserve warmed me more than I expected. When Michael came home that evening, I asked him if we could talk. Just us. We sat at the kitchen table again. I told him I needed time before signing anything. His shoulders tightened. He said the contract was for everyone's protection. I asked him who he thought needed protection from whom. He looked away. "I raised you," I said softly. "I don't remember charging you interest when you needed help." He rubbed his face, suddenly tired. For a moment, I saw my little boy again, the one who scraped his knee and ran to me without fear. Then Susan's car pulled into the driveway, and the moment passed. Later, alone, I opened my phone and reread my notes. Dates, amounts, words spoken, words avoided. I realized I wasn't trapped. I was simply standing at the edge of a truth I had avoided because it hurt too much to name. Have you ever felt that moment when love turns conditional and you're the last one to notice? I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because anything had improved, but because I had stopped lying to myself. And once you do that, even a small room can feel like solid ground. I started leaving the house more often after that, not to escape, but to remind myself that the world still knew my name. The library was 10 minutes away, a low brick building with wide windows and the same quiet dignity it had carried for decades. Inside, no one rushed me. No one watched the clock when I sat too long. I signed my name on the guest log in careful cursive, Eleanor Hayes, and felt strangely whole seeing it, written without explanation. At a corner table, I spread out my papers the way Frank used to spread out maps before a road trip. Bank statements, grocery receipts, the unsigned contract. I wasn't building a case yet. I was learning the shape of my own situation. There is power in understanding the rules someone else assumes you won't read. A librarian named Margaret noticed me coming in regularly. She had silver hair pulled into a low bun and wore cardigans even in summer. One afternoon, as I struggled with the copier, she came over and showed me how to adjust the contrast so the numbers printed clearly. We talked about nothing important at first. Weather, the price of stamps. Eventually, she asked if everything was all right at home. I didn't tell her details. I just said, "I'm learning to stand again." She nodded as if she understood exactly what that meant. Back at the house, the atmosphere shifted in small, tightening ways. Susan began asking when I'd be signing. Michael avoided the subject, but left the contract on the counter, then the table, then slipped it into my room one afternoon as if it might quietly take care of itself. I placed it back where it belonged, untouched. The third twist arrived, disguised as generosity. Susan announced one evening that she'd found a senior apartment complex nearby. "Just in case you want independence," she said brightly. She handed me a brochure, already folded open to the pricing page. The rent was higher than my entire monthly income. She said it would be so nice for me to have my own space again. Michael nodded, relieved, as if this solved something he hadn't wanted to admit was a problem. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway long after turning off the engine. The porch light glowed behind the security camera, steady and unblinking. I thought about how quickly "come live with us" had turned into "have you considered leaving?" Inside my purse was my phone, buzzing softly. A voicemail from the legal aid office. I listened to it twice. They had an opening the following week. The meeting took place in a modest building that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The attorney, a woman in her 40s with calm eyes, asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I spoke slowly, choosing my words the way you choose dishes from a cabinet you don't want to rattle. She listened. She took notes. She asked questions that cut cleanly to the center of things. When I showed her the contract, she raised her eyebrows just slightly. When I explained the payments I'd already made, she nodded. "You have rights," she said, "and more importantly, you have options." She explained that without my signature, the document meant very little. She explained that my contributions could legally be considered household support, not rent, depending on how they were framed. She explained things patiently without drama. I walked out lighter than I had in months. At home, Susan noticed the change before Michael did. I stood straighter. I stopped apologizing for using the kitchen. I stopped asking permission to come and go. When she reminded me about quiet hours one evening, I smiled and said, "Thank you for letting me know," and continued exactly as I was. Politeness can be armor if you wear it properly. Michael tried once more. He sat across from me, hands folded. "Mom, we just want this to be fair," he said. I met his eyes. "So do I replied. And for the first time, I meant it in a way that did not require me to shrink. The receipts continued to pile up in my envelope. The notes in my phone grew longer. I didn't know yet what I would do with them. I only knew that I was done being confused on purpose, and that, at my age, clarity felt less like bitterness and more like mercy. The first real boundary I set felt so small that I almost laughed afterward. Susan asked me to pick up a prescription for her on my way back from the library. She said it casually, already assuming my yes. I told her I couldn't that day. I had an appointment. The word hung between us, unfamiliar and firm. She blinked, surprised, then said, "Oh," and turned back to her phone. Nothing dramatic happened. The house didn't shake. No one shouted. But something shifted all the same. I realized how rarely I had said no in my life, and how often people had built entire expectations on that silence. A few days later, Michael asked if I could transfer my grocery spending to a shared app they used for household expenses. "It'll be easier to track," he said. I told him I preferred keeping my own records. He frowned, not angry, just unsettled, like someone who realizes the ground is not as soft as they thought. "I already do," I added gently. That part was true. I just didn't explain how thoroughly. Susan began testing new edges. She asked if I planned to be home for dinner. I said I wasn't sure. She asked if I could watch the kids the following Saturday. I told her I had plans. I did not explain that my plans involved nothing more than a quiet morning and a long walk. Those still count. One evening, she approached me with a printed spreadsheet. She pointed to a line where she'd calculated the value of shared utilities and internet usage. "I just want to make sure we're aligned," she said. I looked at the page, then back at her. "I haven't agreed to any of this yet," I replied calmly. "So alignment might be premature." Her lips tightened, she folded the paper and walked away without another word. That night, I received an email from Michael. Subject line, household agreement follow-up. It outlined expectations in polite corporate language. Deadlines, transparency, cooperation. I read it twice, then forwarded it to my personal email and saved it. I did not respond. At the legal aid office, the attorney reviewed the email and nodded. "This is helpful," she said. "Keep everything, especially anything in writing." She suggested I send a brief reply stating that I was still reviewing my options and had not agreed to any terms. Neutral, factual, no emotion. I followed her advice exactly. When I sent the message, my hands were steady. The reaction came sooner than I expected. Susan stopped including me in family conversations. Plans were made around me instead of with me. The children noticed and asked why Grandma didn't come to movie night anymore. Susan said I was busy. I was. Busy reclaiming myself. Michael grew quieter. He still kissed my forehead, but his eyes carried a question he didn't ask. I wondered if he felt caught between loyalty and convenience, or if he had already chosen and simply didn't want to say it out loud. One afternoon while sorting mail, I found a letter addressed to me from the Homeowners Association. It listed occupancy guidelines and parking regulations. I recognized Susan's handwriting on the envelope flap. She had opened it before giving it to me. I folded the letter carefully and added it to my folder. Another small truth documented. I began looking at apartments again, not the ones Susan had circled, but modest places within my means. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I was choosing, not reacting. That evening, I sat on my bed and opened an old photo album I'd brought with me. Frank and me on our wedding day. Michael as a baby, sleeping on my chest. Years of giving, of building, of holding things together quietly. I traced a finger over the faces and felt no regret, only resolve. I wasn't angry. That surprised me most of all. I was simply done being convenient, and once that decision settled in my chest, it felt as solid as any home I had ever lived in. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, quiet and precise, like everything else Susan preferred to be. Subject line, notice regarding living arrangement. I read it standing at the kitchen counter while the kettle cooled beside me. It informed me that, since I had not signed the agreement, they would need clarity on my long-term plans. It suggested, kindly but firmly, that I provide a timeline for moving out. I stared at the words longer than necessary, not because they shocked me, but because they confirmed something I had already felt in my bones. I was no longer family in their eyes. I was an unresolved issue. I replied the way my attorney had taught me. Brief, calm. I acknowledged receipt. I stated that I was exploring options and would respond when I had concrete information. No promises, no apologies. Susan did not respond. Instead, the house changed temperature, not in degrees, but in spirit. Doors closed more softly. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. The children were ushered upstairs more often. I became a shadow that moved through shared spaces carefully, deliberately. One afternoon, Michael asked if we could talk. His voice carried that careful tone again, the one that made him sound older than his years and younger than his courage. We sat in the living room this time. The television was off. The camera's faint red light blinked near the ceiling. He told me they felt uncomfortable without clear boundaries. He said uncertainty was stressful. He said Susan felt disrespected. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him if he remembered the year his company downsized and he lost his job, how he and Susan had stayed in our guest room for 4 months, how Frank never once asked for rent. Michael swallowed. That was different, he said. Yes, I replied. It was. That night, I cried for the first time since moving in. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears sliding down as I folded laundry that wasn't entirely mine. I cried for the boy I raised and the man he had become. I cried for the version of myself that had believed love would protect me from paperwork. Have you ever realized too late that the rules had changed and no one bothered to tell you? The next morning, I scheduled a second meeting with my attorney. This time, we talked logistics, notice periods, tenant rights, even without a signed contract. She explained that their written communications and acceptance of money could establish certain obligations on their part. She spoke plainly, without promising outcomes, and that steadiness grounded me. Back at the house, I began packing slowly, not as a retreat, but as preparation. I labeled boxes neatly, books, clothes, photos. Susan noticed and asked, "So you've decided?" I told her I was organizing. Nothing more, nothing less. The children hovered near my door that evening. My grandson asked if I was leaving. I told him I was finding a place that fit me better. He nodded, accepting it the way children accept weather. Still, when he hugged me, he held on longer than usual. Michael avoided my eyes for days after that. On Friday, a small but telling moment arrived. Susan handed me a printed sheet outlining a proposed move-out date and a breakdown of final utilities. She spoke quickly, as if speed might make it easier. I took the paper, thanked her, and said I would review it. Later, I scanned it and sent it to my attorney. Another piece of the puzzle. That evening, I went for a walk alone. The air was cool, the kind that smells like leaves in distant rain. I walked past houses where lights glowed warmly behind curtains. I thought about how many years I had spent making homes for others, and how strange it felt to now be negotiating my own space like a stranger. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. Strength, quiet and unshowy. I had survived harder things than this, and I was no longer afraid of standing alone if it meant standing whole. When I returned, the house was silent. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed among half-packed boxes. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a shrinking place. It felt like a doorway. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I would not sign away my dignity for the comfort of being tolerated. And that knowledge, earned late but honestly, was worth every uneasy night that had led me here. The apartment I found was not impressive, but it was honest. A second-floor unit above a quiet bakery with windows that rattled slightly when buses passed, and a kitchen small enough to force you to be intentional. The landlord, Mr. Kaplan, was in his 70s and spoke slowly, like time still listened to him. He asked about my income, my references, my plans. When I told him I wanted peace, he smiled and said, "That's the best reason I've heard all week." I didn't tell Michael right away. I signed the lease at a small desk that smelled faintly of flour and coffee, and when I slid my pen back into my purse, I felt something click into place inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, just alignment. At home, Susan noticed my lighter step. Before she noticed the boxes were disappearing, I took a few things at a time to avoid tension. Books first, winter coats, then the photo album. The children asked questions, and I answered them simply. No blame, no bitterness, just truth in manageable pieces. Michael finally asked one evening, standing awkwardly in the doorway of my room, So, you found a place? I nodded. His shoulders dropped, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was relief or regret. I'm glad, he said. I just want you to be okay. I am, I replied. And for once, it wasn't something I had to convince myself of. The legal details moved quietly in the background. My attorney reviewed the proposed move-out sheet Susan had prepared and sent back a short response clarifying dates and disputing a few charges. There was no argument, just facts. Susan replied with a revised version. Cooler, cleaner. We were no longer pretending this was about family. We were finishing business. On my last morning in the house, I woke early and made coffee one final time. I cleaned the counter I had used for months, wiped it carefully, and left the sponge where it belonged. I walked through the rooms slowly, not lingering, just acknowledging. The living room where I had felt watched, the hallway where I had learned to walk quietly, the kitchen table where paper had replaced trust. Susan thanked me for handling things maturely. I nodded. Michael hugged me, a little too tightly, as if trying to hold on to something already gone. The children waved from the stairs. I waved back, smiling. Outside, the camera blinked as I loaded the last box into my Buick. I didn't look up at it this time. The bakery apartment welcomed me with the smell of bread and the sound of laughter drifting up from the sidewalk. I unpacked slowly, setting things down where they felt right. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched strangers pass, anonymous and free. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, and there is a difference that matters. Later, as I balanced my checkbook and pinned the lease to a corkboard, I realized how quietly everything had unfolded. No shouting, no slammed doors, just choices, made one after another, each one pulling me closer to myself. I went to bed that night in a room that was entirely mine. The silence was not empty. It was spacious, and as I drifted off, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Safety. The first weeks in my new apartment unfolded slowly, the way careful healing does. Each morning I woke to the sound of the bakery downstairs preparing for the day, trays sliding into ovens, a bell ringing softly as the front door opened. The smell of warm bread drifted up through my floorboards and reminded me, again and again, that life continued in small, generous ways, whether we noticed or not. I learned the rhythms of the place. Mr. Kaplan watered the potted plants on the stairs every Tuesday and Thursday. A woman in a red coat passed my window at exactly 8:15 each morning, always on the phone, always laughing. The radiator hissed at night like it was clearing its throat before telling an old story. These details mattered. They anchored me. I set up my kitchen first. It was small, but it was mine. I lined the cabinet shelves with paper and placed my plates carefully, choosing the ones with the tiny blue flowers around the rim. Frank had chipped one of them years ago while washing dishes, and I smiled when I saw the flaw. Some damage is proof of love, not neglect. I opened a new notebook and began writing expenses the way I always had, except now there was no one waiting to audit them. Rent, utilities, groceries, everything fit, narrowly but honestly. For the first time since Frank died, my finances felt quiet. No surprises, no assumptions, just numbers that told the truth. Michael called on the third Sunday after my move. His voice sounded tentative, like someone knocking on a door they weren't sure would open. He asked how I was settling in. I told him about the bakery, about the radiator, about how the windows rattled when buses passed. He laughed softly and said it sounded charming. He did not apologize. I did not ask him to. Susan did not call. Instead, an envelope arrived in my mailbox 2 days later. Inside was a forwarded bill from the utility company, marked Final Balance. There was a handwritten note clipped to it. Please remit your portion. No greeting, no signature, just instruction. I sat at my kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting across the wood, and read it twice. The amount was higher than expected. Not outrageous, but wrong. I pulled out my folder, the one that had followed me quietly from room to room for months. I laid out my copies of statements, my notes, my calendar entries. I compared dates, usage periods, meter readings. Something didn't align. I called the utility company and waited on hold for 17 minutes, listening to soft music that tried too hard to be calming. When a representative finally came on the line, I explained the situation plainly. She pulled up the account and read off the dates. The billing cycle extended 2 weeks past my move-out date. I told her that wasn't correct. I had documentation. She asked me to email it. I sent the documents while we were still on the phone. She thanked me for being organized. She said the account would be adjusted. She said the revised balance would be mailed within 5 business days. When the new bill arrived, it was nearly half the amount Susan had demanded. I wrote a check for the corrected total, noted the reference number on the memo line, and mailed it certified, return receipt requested. I kept the stub. I scanned everything. I slept well that night. The next envelope was thicker. This one came from a law office I didn't recognize. The letterhead was sharp and expensive looking. It stated that I had failed to meet certain financial obligations related to my prior living arrangement and requested immediate settlement to avoid further action. I read the letter once, then again, slower. My hands didn't shake. They rested calmly on the table. I felt something like sadness, but didn't, the way you feel when you see a storm moving across land you no longer live on. I called my attorney. She listened. She sighed, not in frustration, but in recognition. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said. "It's common, and it's sloppy." She asked me to forward the letter. She asked me if I still had everything. I told her yes. She drafted the response herself. It was firm, factual, and unsentimental. It outlined the timeline. It attached proof of payments. It noted the corrected utility bill. It stated clearly that any further communication should come through her office. She sent it that afternoon. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, this one thinner. Inside was a short note from the law office acknowledging receipt of documentation and stating that no further action would be taken at this time. At this time, the phrase almost made me smile. Michael called that evening. He sounded strained. He said he'd heard from Susan's attorney. He said things had gotten out of hand. I told him calmly that I had handled everything appropriately and legally. He asked why I hadn't just talked to them. "I did," I said. "I just did it in writing." There was a long pause. Then he said, quietly, "I never thought it would go this far." I looked around my apartment. At the folded blanket on the chair, at the small plant on the windowsill, at the framed photo of Frank and me at the lake, sunburned and smiling. "Neither did I," replied. "But here we are." After that, the call stopped. Weeks passed. My life expanded in ways I hadn't planned. I joined a morning walking group that met at the park 3 blocks away. Women my age, all carrying different histories, all walking at a pace that allowed conversation. We talked about books, about knees that no longer cooperated, about grandchildren and regrets. No one asked what I used to be. They only cared about who I was now. I volunteered at the library twice a week, shelving books and helping people navigate the printer. Margaret smiled when she saw me and said I looked lighter. I told her I had learned to travel with less. One afternoon, while sorting returned books, I overheard a conversation at the front desk. A woman was crying softly, papers clutched in her hand. Something about a lease dispute, late fees, threats. I didn't interrupt. I didn't insert myself. But later, when she sat alone near the windows, I handed her a tissue and told her, gently, to keep copies of everything. She looked at me like I'd given her a map. At home that night, I thought about how easily life teaches the same lesson over and over, just in different voices. How often we are told to be agreeable, to be flexible, to keep the peace. How rarely anyone warns us what that costs. Another envelope arrived near the end of the month. This one was from the homeowners association Michael and Susan belonged to. It stated that a security deposit refund related to my occupancy was being processed and asked me to confirm my mailing address. I stared at the letter, puzzled. There had never been a security deposit, not officially. I called the number listed and spoke with a polite man who explained that a deposit had been recorded when the tenant agreement was drafted internally. It had been logged even though the contract was unsigned. When the occupancy ended, the system flagged it for refund. "How much?" I asked. He told me the amount. It was substantial. I thanked him and confirmed my address. When the check arrived, I held it in my hands for a long time. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented. A paper trail, an assumption made without consent, a system correcting itself because documentation existed. I deposited the check the next day and placed the receipt in my folder. Then, for the first time, I closed the folder and put it in the back of my closet. I didn't need to look at it anymore. The quiet satisfaction that settled over me was not sharp or triumphant. It was steady, like knowing your feet are planted firmly on ground that won't suddenly give way. Some evenings, I still thought about Michael, about the boy he had been, about the man he was still trying to be. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish him harm. I simply wished he had chosen differently. But wishes are not plans. And plans, I had learned, require clarity, patience, and the courage to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. On the night the bakery downstairs celebrated its anniversary, music drifted up through my floorboards, and laughter followed. I opened my window and let the sound fill the room. I stood there, watching the lights on the street, feeling neither young nor old, but fully present. I had not raised my voice. I had not broken the law. I had not demanded revenge. I had simply refused to be small. And in that refusal, a new life had quietly taken shape, sturdy and lawful and entirely my own. Life did not rush back into me all at once. It returned the way warmth does after a long winter, quietly, without asking permission. By the time I realized I was no longer bracing myself each morning, the habit of peace had already taken root. My days followed a rhythm now, one I chose rather than endured. I woke early, not because anxiety pushed me out of sleep, but because the bakery downstairs did. The low thud of trays being set down, the soft scrape of a broom on concrete, the smell of yeast and heat rising gently through the floorboards. I brewed my coffee slowly and drank it by the window, watching the street come alive without feeling the need to belong to any of it. The absence of tension was its own kind of presence. No one tracked my movements. No one recalculated my value based on what I provided that day. I could sit in silence without wondering how it would be interpreted. That freedom was subtle, but it reshaped everything. Michael did not call often. When he did, the conversations were careful, almost formal. He asked about my health, the apartment, the neighborhood. I answered honestly, but briefly. There was a politeness between us now, a respectful distance that still carried grief underneath it. I suspected he was learning something too, though not in the way I had. Some lessons take longer to settle. Susan never reached out directly. Instead, her presence arrived only through paperwork, as if that was the only language she trusted. Once, a forwarded email from a service provider mistakenly included me in a thread discussing account closures related to my former tenancy. I read it without reacting and deleted it. The word no longer stung. It simply described something that had ended. I spent more time outdoors as the weather softened. The walking group grew familiar enough that we no longer introduced ourselves. We just fell into step beside one another. There was comfort in moving forward together without needing to explain where we had been. After walks, we sometimes sat on benches, talking about recipes or old television shows, the kind of conversations that rest rather than drain you. Arthur remained a quiet constant. We never discussed labels or expectations. We spoke about books we half remembered, about spouses who still occupied space in our sentences, about how the body changes in ways the mind is slow to forgive. When we parted, we always did so kindly, without promises. That felt like respect. At the library, I noticed how people gravitated toward calm. They did not seek answers as much as steadiness. When I helped them sort through documents or navigate online portals, I spoke slowly, explaining each step without urgency. Fear recedes when it is not fed. I watched shoulders lower, breathing slow, eyes clear. It reminded me of myself months earlier, hunched over unfamiliar rules, afraid of making the wrong move. One afternoon, I received a call from the bank asking to confirm the closure of a shared account that had once been used for household expenses. I confirmed it politely. When I hung up, I sat for a long moment, phone still in my hand. That account had represented trust once. Now it represented completion. Both truths could exist. I began cooking again, not out of obligation, but joy. Simple meals, soups that simmered all afternoon, bread toasted just enough to crackle. I ate at my small table, sometimes with music playing softly, sometimes in silence. There was no rush to clean, no sense of being evaluated. The kitchen returned to what it had always been for me, a place of nourishment, not negotiation. Mail arrived less frequently, but I still opened it carefully, habit lingering even when necessity faded. One day, an envelope from the Homeowners Association arrived by mistake, addressed to me but clearly meant for Susan. I returned it unopened with a note indicating the error. I did not feel tempted to read it. Curiosity no longer held power over me. As months passed, I realized I had stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. There was no longer a need to prepare explanations or defenses. My thoughts moved forward instead of looping back. That, more than anything, told me I was healing. During the holidays, I chose to stay home. I decorated lightly, only what pleased me. A small tree by the window, white lights, a few ornaments that carried memories without demanding them. I cooked a modest dinner and invited Margaret and Arthur. We laughed, ate too much pie, and shared stories that didn't require conclusions. When they left, I washed dishes slowly, grateful for the quiet that followed. Michael sent a card. No return address, just his handwriting. Inside, a simple message wishing me peace. I placed it on my mantel and left it there. It was enough winter deepened. Snow fell in patient layers. I learned the sound my boots made on the stairs, the way the lock turned just slightly before catching. These small certainties mattered. They reminded me that control does not always come from authority or ownership. Sometimes it comes from familiarity and consent. One evening, as I organized old photographs, I came across a picture of myself taken years ago, holding my grandson as a baby. My face was softer then, less guarded. I studied it without sadness. That woman had loved freely because she believed love would protect her. I did not fault her for that belief. I simply knew better now. Another letter arrived late in the season, this one from Susan's attorney again. Brief, final. It confirmed that all records reflected a settled account and that no further correspondence was anticipated. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Closure, I learned, does not need ceremony. The last lingering effect surprised me. I found myself more willing to speak plainly with others. When a neighbor crossed a boundary, I addressed it kindly but directly. When a volunteer coordinator asked too much, I declined without guilt. The fear of displeasing had loosened its grip. Respect, I discovered, often arrives only after you stop chasing approval. As spring approached, I cleaned my apartment thoroughly, opening windows and letting air move through rooms that had held so much quiet rebuilding. I rearranged furniture slightly, not because it was necessary, but because I could. The space responded easily, adapting without resistance. One afternoon, I stood by the window and watched the bakery reopen after a short renovation. New sign, same smell, life, continuing. I thought again about the moment Michael had slid the contract across the table. How small I had felt, how uncertain. I did not wish that version of myself erased. She had walked me here. What surprised me most was that I no longer wanted anything from them. Not an apology, not understanding, not reconciliation. I wanted them to live with their choices, just as I had lived with mine. That acceptance felt like freedom. My life was quieter now, but not diminished. It was shaped by intention rather than reaction, by consent rather than assumption. I had learned that being kind does not require being available, and that generosity without boundaries is simply another form of neglect. When night fell, I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of my building settling. I felt steady, rooted, unafraid. Nothing was missing. Everything that remained belonged to me. The morning I understood that the memory no longer carried weight, I was standing at the sink, rinsing a teacup I had already cleaned once. Sunlight rested on the counter in a soft, ordinary way, and for a moment I watched the steam rise and disappear. Nothing dramatic happened, no rush of emotion, just a quiet realization settling into my chest. The story no longer hurt to remember. I was 69 by then. Another birthday had come and gone without ceremony. A walk in the park, a shared slice of cake, a few warm phone calls. I noticed that I no longer measured milestones by who showed up for me, but by how present I felt within myself. That felt new and earned. My reflection in the kitchen window surprised me. My face looked calmer than I remembered it being. The lines were still there, deeper in some places, but they no longer felt like evidence of strain. They felt like proof of survival. I looked like someone who had stopped bracing for impact. Michael and I spoke occasionally. Our conversations were careful, polite, almost formal, but no longer strained. We talked about the weather, about work, about small repairs around his house. We avoided the past without pretending it hadn't happened. I didn't ask questions that would reopen wounds, and he didn't offer explanations that would only serve to soothe his own discomfort. In an odd way, that mutual restraint felt like a form of respect we had never quite managed before. Susan remained absent from my life, and I allowed that absence to stay intact. I stopped wondering what version of events she carried, or how she justified them to herself. That curiosity had once felt necessary, like understanding her would somehow complete the story. Now I understood something else instead. Closure does not require agreement. It only requires acceptance. My days were full in quiet, unremarkable ways. Mornings volunteering at the library, afternoons walking familiar paths, watching seasons shift without resistance, evenings cooking simple meals and cleaning up slowly, without anyone waiting for me to finish or judging how long I took. No one tracked my usefulness. No one counted what I contributed. I existed without explanation, and that was enough. Every now and then, I thought about how close I had come to signing that contract. How one tired evening, one misplaced hope, might have locked me into a life defined by rules I had never agreed to. The thought no longer frightened me. It humbled me. Small decisions, made quietly, can redirect entire futures. One afternoon, Arthur walked me home after our usual stroll. We stood at the bottom of the stairs, lingering as we often did, speaking about nothing in particular. Then he asked me, simply, if I was happy. The question wasn't heavy, it wasn't searching, it was kind. I didn't answer right away. I checked myself honestly. Yes, I said. And for the first time in a long while, the word didn't feel like something I was trying to convince myself of. That evening, I pulled the old folder from the back of my closet, the one that had followed me quietly through every stage of uncertainty. I spread its contents across the table. Leases, letters, proofs of payment, legal correspondence. Once, these papers had represented fear and vigilance. Now they were just paper. I kept what mattered. I shredded the rest slowly, listening to the steady sound as strips fell away. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just gratitude for the clarity those documents had given me when I needed it most. I sat for a long time afterward, thinking about the woman I had been when I first moved in with my son. How eager she had been to be helpful. How willing she had been to make herself smaller to preserve harmony. She hadn't been weak, she had been loving in the only way she knew how. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't warn her harshly or tell her she should have known better. I would simply say this: love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is convenience wearing a familiar face. Over time, I began sharing my story quietly, when it felt right. At the library, on park benches, in conversations with women who carried the same tightness in their shoulders I once did. I didn't offer advice like instructions. I offered it like a lamp, something to hold if the path felt dark. Keep your records, read what you're asked to sign. Pause when something feels wrong, even if everyone else insists it's normal. Some listened closely. Some nodded, but weren't ready. That was all right. Readiness arrives on its own schedule. One warm evening near the end of summer, I sat by my window watching the streetlights flicker on. The bakery downstairs closed for the night, the familiar sounds settling into silence. I realized I felt no pull toward any other place, no longing for a house that wasn't mine, no ache for approval that once felt essential to survival. My life was smaller than it had been once, but it was truer. And truth, I had learned, takes up exactly the space it needs, no more, no less. I didn't win loudly. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't shout or threaten or break a single law. I simply stayed calm long enough for the rules to work the way they were meant to, for protection, not pressure. That was my retribution. Quiet, legal, complete. And if you've listened all the way to the end, thank you for staying with me. Stories like this are carried by many people, even if they're rarely spoken out loud. If mine resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've lived or are still living, you're not alone. You're welcome to like this story, subscribe, or share your thoughts. So let me ask you, gently and honestly, if you were in my place, what would you have done?